You can what?
Do you know how I can get my presenter notes to come up here?
Your presenter notes?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't know how to do that on Keynote.
Do you know how I can get the presenter notes to come up on Keynote while I'm presenting?
So, here, we're going to use a separate display.
May not work.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I guess that's the same way PowerPoint does it.
And now when you go to play, this will be
Awesome. Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay. I think we are ready to start. Hi. Am I loud enough? This isn't quite loud enough.
You're never allowed.
Is there a volume on here? No.
Okay. I'll hold it like this. Okay. Thank you so much for waiting. And I'm so sorry for the delay. So we'll start with a 20-minute delay, and we'll just go with it. So I apologize this wasn't up here earlier. Volunteers have, most of the volunteers have that password, so if you need it later, try asking one of them. Welcome to WIAD Boston. This is an event celebrating information architecture. Thank you for being here. So I'll try to cover my announcements a little more quickly than, oops, this is not going backwards. So we are one of 61 locations in 26 different countries having events today or close to today. The first one started on Thursday in Moscow and in the Philippines about 12 and a half hours ago, and they go through to the West Coast tonight. All of these events are organized by local volunteers. Here in Boston, I think what's amazing to me is I think we have people in here from Maryland, New York, Rhode Island, Western Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Did I miss anything? Any other states? I see the Maryland person right over there. Florida, of course. Abby's here from Florida. And I also want to welcome our live audiences watching our live stream in Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, Victoria, British Columbia, and individuals around the world watching online. Some of you know that within the past year, the Information Architecture Institute has dissolved as a professional association, which was a very sad thing for those of us who were involved. However, as a result, has become its own nonprofit organization. That's thanks to the hard work and sacrifice of this year's global team and the board of directors who are working to make World IA Day a sustainable, inclusive, and transparent organization. This is just the beginning of an organization that needs its community in order to survive. So if this is something that's important to you, or if you have ideas on what a World IA Day organization should look like, think about reaching out to them and volunteering. We will kick off with a short welcome video produced by the global team.
How many times were you not able to see? In this to spread the word about information architecture.
Not getting audio here. Let's try something.
just play it for your...
Yeah.
How many times were you not able to see? In this year, our goal is clear: to spread the word about information architecture. We'll celebrate our past by honoring where we have come from and those who came before us. We'll celebrate our present, pushing them and challenging new ways of accessing knowledge. We'll celebrate our future, reimagining ourselves and new forms of collaboration.
All right, I'm sorry.
You're doing great, man.
How many times were you not able to see? In this year, our goal is clear: to spread the word about information architecture. We'll celebrate our past by honoring where we have come from and those who came before us. We'll celebrate our present, pushing boundaries and challenging new ways of accessing knowledge. We'll celebrate our future, reimagining ourselves and new forms of collaboration. Each part counts for its own purpose, but all elements must work together. The meaning behind it is the IA element.
Happy World WIAD Day from Pittsburgh, PA!
Okay. Hola.
Feliz Día Mundial de la Arquitectura de la Información desde
Barcelona.
Привет из Петербурга! День информационной архитектуры! Ура!
Happy World WIAD Day from Ann Arbor!
Hola. Feliz Día Mundial de la Arquitectura de la Información 2020. Desde Honduras, con todo corazón. Muchas gracias por invitarnos a ser parte de la celebración.
Wspaniałego Dnia Architektury i Informacji!
Happy World WIAD Day from Dallas, Texas, USA!
Namaste!
Ciao a tutti, io sono Andrea Resmini e volevo augurarvi una buona giornata mondiale dell'architettura dell'informazione. To all our friends around the world, have a great World Information Architecture Day from Italy.
Happy World WIAD Day from Toronto!
Организатор Международного дня информационной архитектуры.
Happy World WIAD Day! Maligayang WIAD! Wireframing! Process mapping! Card sorting!
Site map.
Welcome to WIAD Day!
Feliz Día Mundial de Arquitectura de Información!
Hello and welcome to World IA Day 2020, celebrating the IA element, the past, present, and future. We're so happy to have you here joining us from around the world, whether it's really cold right now or where it's really warm. Thank you. We hope that you enjoy your time, whether you're a first timer at one of these events or a long-time pro. Please take the time to get to know each other, and we hope that you have a great day. Take care.
All right. So just a few announcements to cover. So first, we have three volunteer organizers. If you're here, you can raise your hand. There's Eve and Jason. If you have any questions, come find one of us. We do have a code of conduct. We're committed to making this a safe and inclusive event for everyone, no matter who you are. If you have any questions or concerns, please do find one of us, or you can contact the global team directly. A little bit of information about the venue. We are in the Washburn Auditorium right now. There are restrooms on this floor if you take a left out of these doors. There are also all-gender restrooms on the first floor of the building, right upstairs. We will, at our 11 a.m. time slot, we'll have 2 additional sessions in other rooms, and I'll give you directions for those later. Public safety is located nearby. They're right next door, and this is their phone number. Again, volunteers have this. And there's no smoking and no alcohol policy. Volunteers are also available throughout the day. You can recognize them by their blue lanyards. We didn't quite have everyone on this list, but I truly want to thank all of the volunteers, sponsors, speakers, and other kinds of helpers who contributed to this event. I think I've probably asked personally for help from at least 60 or 70 of these people over the last few months. So please take a moment to thank them. Our sponsors are also here at the event. Some of them are hiring or offering education programs. Feel free to stand up if you're from one of these organizations. Leslie University College of Art and Design is providing the live stream. Leslie offers certificate and degree programs in design and user experience, including several online programs. CVS Health is here. Northeastern University College of Arts, Media and Design, which also have deep ties to information architecture, are also here. And Huddle, Last Call Media, MadPal, and ClearPoint are also sponsoring us. And all of these organizations are critical to this event. We could not be doing it without them, so thank you. We have 9 global sponsors as well. We'll be sending out this link after the event by email, but they're providing a number of coupons and giveaways, free book by Richard Saul Wurman, drawing. There's a conference discount for the Information Architecture Conference coming up in April in New Orleans. On the topic, I also want to briefly mention that this year the Academic and Practitioner Roundtable at the IA conference is focused on the topic of values in information architecture, and that also needs to be an inclusive conversation. So all are welcome to the conference overall and to the roundtable. At a separate URL, there's a contest for to get to Euro IA. And we'll have a few prizes, drawings that we'll be doing later in the day. We have books from a few of our speakers here, and prizes from global sponsors. So these are great. This is great stuff. Our official hashtags, globally at the top and locally at the bottom. So please feel free to tweet during the day and use these hashtags. I also hear that there's some kind of secret contest for people who are using the top 2 hashtags. I don't know what it is. Okay, so now that we've covered the announcements, and before we bring Abby up, I'd like to shift gears and talk for a couple minutes about the theme for this year. So the global theme for World IA Day is the IA element. But what is the IA element? What does that mean? It's open to interpretation. Here's a little bit about what I think it means. The IA element represents the idea that information architecture is elemental to everything we do. It's elemental to design, technology, products, and services. It's elemental to the connections between us, our stakeholders, and the end users. Those of us working in design, technology, and communications often have a special role where we're not only creating the parts, but we're the ones connecting the dots, finding out how the system works, and helping our colleagues understand the connections that are difficult to see, making the invisible visible. In the IA community, we often hear that you don't have to be an information architect to practice information architecture. And most people are practicing information architecture even if they don't know it. We organize information for other people to understand it. We put things in categories. We choose the words we use to explain what things are. But it's not just that we organize information. As human beings, and especially as designers, we're constantly transforming the basic concepts and structures that we all experience in our human lives. We create order. The products we build and the actions we take produce the shared environment that we and others live in. That is also information architecture. And thoughtful, responsible information architecture is needed now more than ever. Our lives are affected more deeply by digital technology, data collection, and algorithmic decision-making. The use of technology and information systems is implicated in urgent challenges for society: socioeconomic disparities, justice, injustice, and inequity, political polarization and disinformation, and global unsustainability. Information architecture architecture decisions play an important role. How can we make sense of this as designers and digital professionals? I have two responses. First, I think in design we tend to fall into a paradigm where the designer is outside of the system, designing interventions that fix problems within the system. But we need to have a paradigm where we are inside the system. We are part of the architecture. 10 years into my practice, I'm only beginning to understand how it's my assumptions and beliefs about how the world works that I've learned from the environment around me that get baked into our information architecture and design decisions. But these assumptions and beliefs can be invisible and unchecked, and they create the status quo of our shared reality. This is why we need to bring diverse perspectives together, ones that don't share the same assumptions, in order to practice architecture and design that is better for human beings. Second, we need to learn and develop the skills in order to tackle information architecture challenges with competence and confidence. That means talking about core topics like information architecture, taxonomy, and navigation, but also other areas of design, research, content, communication, and building connections between them. So today you're going to hear about the IA element. You'll hear from speakers who are experts in a variety of different areas. Some have deep backgrounds in IA. Some are experts in other areas with deep connections to IA. So I'm very excited to have these speakers with us. I hope you enjoy. Stay for the whole day. And with that, we'll begin with Abby Covert. We'll just get set up here. I think most of you know who Abby is. Abby is an information architect at Etsy. She's also been a leader in the IA field in many ways. Been part of the founding of WIAD leadership in the IA Institute, teaching information architecture, and many other things. But here, set up, I'll leave it to her. Okay. So, thank you.
Hello, hello, hello.
Good morning.
Hello, Boston. Can you all hear me in the back? Yes. Yes, awesome. Okay, all right, let's get this thing going. Whew, that was such an amazing intro, Dan. I really appreciate everything that you said, and I think that the talk I'm about to give is very much in line with that setup, so thank you for that. Okay, so the of everything. That seems like a fairly large topic to tackle on a Saturday on this cold February day. I am from Florida. I am very cold. My feet are cold. I hope that I will be warm from nerves by the end of this talk. We'll see. Ask me after. So, dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to celebrate the union of information and architecture. Information with its peculiarities and nuances, messy and human, and architecture with its strength of structure and dependable steadfastness. This might be an unlikely match to some, perhaps, but anyone who has spent some quality time with these two will tell you a very different story. Only when you start to understand how these two work together to create a whole that is far greater than the sum of its parts will you get it. Have you ever had a really tough time understanding something until someone broke it down into its pieces, or maybe related it to something that you already understand? Maybe it was a concept in school, or a hard problem at work, or maybe a skill that you've been trying to master. We've all had that moment when we encounter the right information in the right arrangement, and it just clicks, and we get it, and there's light bulbs, and there's fireworks, and there's epiphanies. And we've all been working with other people on hard problems, and no matter how many times we talk it through, we end up spin upside down, wrapped up in the tentacles of complexity, until that moment when that one brave soul starts to draw it out on a whiteboard, or maybe even a napkin. And everyone stands in a well-distanced semicircle, observing this vulnerable act of sense-making. It's kind of crazy, right? But then, like magic, one by one, all of their shoulders relax, and they start to enter into that conversation. Their outstretched fingers bring them closer to the center, where we're going to find agreement. This is the power of information architecture. IA can give some of the greatest gifts of all gifts: clarity, direction, and agreement. So here we are, almost 50 years after the words information and architecture met and fell madly in love. and 25 years into the field of information architecture meeting to discuss itself regularly, and 8 years into this wonderful event celebrating information architecture in local communities all around the world. But what do we have to show for it? We have a decline in jobs with information architecture explicitly within the outlined responsibilities. We are seeing the elimination of IA specialists from many organizations. The creation of UX and design programs often do not teach the skills of IA, or they've reduced them to a lecture on making sitemaps. And the job market is out there telling young IAs to generalize into UX design or perish in academia or consulting. We have more sense makers now than we have ever had before, yet they are being told that their skills are only narrowly applicable to one type of work, user experience design. Now, it would be more than easy to be very disheartened by the reality that I see before us. In fact, if I were a pessimist and I saw these clues as signals to our future, I might come to the very easy conclusion that we are seeing the end of information architecture. Now, lucky for the direction of this talk and this day, I am not a pessimist. I am ever the optimist, and I see these as clues to a clearer future. Because ultimately, I see these as the information architecture challenges that are in front of our community. I see these as strong signals of where we need to put our collective efforts. We need to show the world how important a concept information architecture is by showing them examples of it in their real lives, good and bad. We need to teach people to be able to point to certain problems in their real lives and confidently describe them as information architecture problems, regardless of their role or interest in fixing those problems. We need to continually iterate on how IA is taught and to whom, and specifically how it's positioned by those teaching within adjacent and related disciplines. We need information architecture to be accessible to the masses as a term that accurately describes a part of the human condition. So I dream of a world where information architecture is like physics in terms of how it's treated in common vernacular. Physics is a concept that everyone can relate to in simple ways in their everyday lives, yet most people don't understand the concept at any kind of depth. But it is generally understood when physics is to blame for something in real life. When my toddler son drops a rubber ball and it bounces wildly all around the room, and my 4-year-old niece asks why does it bounce so uncontrollably, physics is the answer. She is not going to understand physics for a really long time, or maybe ever at all if she's anything like me. But there's some kind of comfort in knowing the word for the thing that is affecting the world around us. Well, when a voter votes in an unintended way on an issue because of confusing structure or language on the ballot, that's a failure of information architecture. And when a form that a caucus leader is asked to use to report the results doesn't make sense to them, and therefore the data is entered wrongly or not at all, that's a failure of information architecture. But today, if you ask that voter or that caucus leader what went wrong, the highest likelihood is that that person would not be able to point to the issue and give it a name. And even worse, the people in charge of those processes also likely don't have a name for this problem. Therefore, they cannot look for the right kind of help. I don't know about you, but watching Iowa struggle to not have a name for IA was particularly meta for me. We've been sharing hashtags for years. I'm guessing I'm not alone. So everyone in the media was so quick to say that it was a failure of training or a failure of math. All a skilled information architect need to do is look at that form for 30 seconds to know the truth. IA is a big part of what failed in Iowa. Now, I like the comparison to physics because information architecture is another concept where the label was given to it far after the concept itself was having an impact on the human experience. Apples were falling from trees far before Aristotle decided to label the field that explained why. Similarly, humans have been creating, navigating, and advancing information architectures for as long as we've been creating information that needed structure to be understandable to others. So I want to be clear as I can be. I don't think that information architecture will ever go away. I think the idea of structuring information for other people is a life skill that everyone benefits from every day, and I believe that everywhere there is information, there is an architecture responsible for delivering that information. Put simply, I believe information architecture is in everything. So with that framing, why would it matter if the term information architecture continues to go unspoken by the masses? Why would it matter if no one other than self-proclaimed information architects knows the label for the thing that everyone is going around doing for themselves and others all day long? Why do the words information architecture even matter at all? Well, let's go back to our physics example. What if there was no term to describe that set of principles and phenomenon that dictates so much of the world around us? It's a ridiculous question to dwell on for very long, right? Because this all-important concept cannot go unnamed now that it is recognizable and apparent to all, even those who do not seek to understand it. It is my greatest hope that information architecture can be on the same path for that recognizable reality. Because IA is an antidote to the part of the human condition that's fraught with complexity and needs tools for making sense. Even more important is the recognition, as Dan said, that the need for information architecture is increasing every day as the world creates seemingly insurmountable mounds of information every second. In confronting my feels on IA's decline into potential obscurity, I had a really important realization. This is a classic information architecture problem to solve, as most things are. What if you had an IA assignment that went something like this? You have a product that you know would be so useful to so many people, yet only people from a certain background or educational path are likely to know about this product at all. With that as our assignment, one of our first steps as IAs might be to identify types of people or types of work where IA is being done now, but under a different name, or maybe no name at all. By making the list, we could start to think of language and structures for teaching those types of users about our product. So I want to spend this time that I have with you today talking about places where IA is practiced all around us, but maybe not under that name. But first, I have a really important question. Show of hands, how many of you own a microwave oven? Okay, I want you to keep your hands up if you know the wattage of your microwave oven. Far fewer of you. Okay. Okay, so a few weeks back, I found myself in one of those IA conundrums of everyday life. My mother-in-law was making dinner, and I overheard her ask my father-in-law, how many watts is our microwave oven? And my father-in-law responded, 1,500. He knew. To which she responded, no, that can't be right. It only goes up to 1,200. At this point, my father-in-law said, don't worry, it probably doesn't even matter. This is where I got intrigued. So I was in the process of writing this talk, and this just sounded like one of those moments to me, you know, one of those little bits of friction in everyday life because of an IA choice that someone else made. So I got involved, as I want to do. So I inquired what was going on. And it turns out she was attempting to heat up some frozen peas, and the instructions varied pretty wildly on how much time you should cook them based on the wattage of your microwave. Now the range was from 800 to 1,200 watts, but the spread of options for cooking times was 2 minutes, which felt like an absolute eternity in like microwave time. So to make matters worse, the alternative that they provided to knowing your wattage is to use a food thermometer. Yeah, okay, so I want you to think about this for a second. Me and my mother-in-law delicately poking peas with a food thermometer in, quote, several spots. Several. Okay. So at this point, I started to get really into figuring this out. And I was like, I bet the wattage is noted on the sticker inside the microwave. Right? Right? Who thinks the wattage was on the sticker in the microwave? Oh, it's going to be a fight out here in a second. Don't worry. Nope. No wattage. But 60 hertz. So, I know. So it turns out this is a problem, but I did the next logical thing that an elder millennial says to her boomer mother-in-law. Let's ask Google to convert hertz to watts. That should work. How many people think that worked? No, it did not work. So it turns out that wattage is like apples and oranges. You cannot convert from one to the other. I learned this in this process. But in looking into this issue, I found that this is not just us, right? This is a fairly well-known concern of microwave cooks the world over. In fact, blogs like Epicurious offer a Mr. Wizard style exercise for figuring out what your microwave wattage is in the all too likely case that the sticker on the inside does not have the wattage marked. They're not the only blog that has this. Now, I hope that you all did not think I was going to leave you hanging, not understanding how to figure out the wattage on your microwave. Now you know. All it takes is a cup of cold water. So surely, at this point in the story, inquiring minds want to know how many minutes we landed on for the peas. Yeah? Okay, so we made the decision to try 6 minutes because it was right in the middle of the scale, and we figured, what could possibly go wrong? It went very wrong. Okay, who thinks that the peas were undercooked? Who thinks the peas were overcooked? Who thinks the peas were just right? No one at all. Okay, the overcooks win. So these peas were way overdone, and to be honest, this is actually the minute that my mind was blown. How can wattage matter so much, yet be presented in such an unclear way? It's almost like the makers of these peas have zero concern for whether or not we will successfully heat and eat their product. We had assumed that the microwave was in the middle of the scale because we also assumed that the scale presented was the entire scale. It's not. I have since confirmed that microwaves go up to 2200 watts. The idea that 6 minutes could equal such an overcooked result was deeply concerning to me. So now we are eating peas that are way too overdone, and we're wondering how this microwave is actually at the highest end of the microwave spectrum. And more importantly, we are feeling really stupid. We are two grown women that are unable to heat peas in a microwave in this year of our Lord 2020. Shouldn't we have figured this out by now? This is one of those everyday IA problems that stems from a few issues commonly seen all over the place in information architecture. And hey, if we're going to be like physics, let's get some names for the things that we see happen over and over again. So the main problem that we're observing in this scenario is what Richard Saul Wurman termed unnecessary exactitude. The microwave watts are a detail that anyone who has spent even a modicum of time with microwaves or users of microwaves would realize is fraught with concern and a lack of clarity. But something else that they would learn is that it turns out there really is very much not a lot to do with microwaves in terms of size and type. Like, you can understand them pretty easily. So it's unnecessary to say 800 or 1200 watts when you could say small countertop microwave versus large installed microwave, which would be much more relatable to most microwave cooks. So why does this even matter? If I hadn't gotten involved in this whole scene, who's to say whether my mother-in-law would even remember this incident a few hours or days later? But here we are, weeks later, and as Pema Chodron would probably point out, I have been completely hooked by this. I am haunted by its significant insignificance. I hate that we face moments like this all day, every day. Moments where a little bit of IA thought from the makers of things would go a long way to helping us feel confident and in control of our own destinies. If you spend enough time with users, you will often hear them blame themselves for not understanding. And unfortunately, in everyday life, we don't have a moderator to remind us that it is the job of the product to make sense, not the job of the user to get it. This moment made me start to dwell on a really important question. What is the collective impact of all of these tiny moments of frustration with oneself? And more importantly, whose problem is this to solve? Is this Walmart's problem because they made the peas? Is this Samsung's problem because they made the microwave? Or does this issue exist purely because it is in the common messy middle where IA problems tend to crop up? There's all this friction in the seemingly innocuous tasks of our day. And honestly, as users, there is little or nothing that we can do about it. My mother-in-law does not shop for frozen peas by whose directions respect her mental model the most. And she does not buy microwave ovens based on whether they have a clear way to communicate wattage. My point is that people can't ask for things to get better when they don't know how to even describe the thing that they're struggling with. As soon as I pointed out to her that the failure was on the person who architected the information on the bag, not her, she got it. And more importantly, she was rightfully pissed off. Her response was, well, Walmart needs better information architects. See how easy that is? You give people the words for the things that they experience, and you empower them to demand that things improve. If nothing else, now when her P's are overdone, she can blame Walmart packaging designers instead of herself for not understanding microwave wattage. So, at this point you might be thinking, that's kind of small potatoes, right? I mean, it's actually really small peas, but stay with me. Look, I'm not here to shame the pea packaging designer for their poor IA choices, although Walmart, I think that you could have done better here. I am not planning on wasting this opportunity speaking with you today, pointing out just petty IA failures. So let's jump to a biggie. Because I don't know about you, but every time I encounter the news media these days, I hear information architecture headlines all over the place. Yet I do not hear them saying those words. There is one area where the implications of IA decisions have high stakes on the fabric of our society. Here we go. Political ideology. It strikes me how often a two-party system is fighting over ontology. And it's amazing how many multi-decade arguments are disagreements surrounding taxonomy. And I doubt that I am alone in thinking that the masterful choreography of information delivery being employed by bots and extreme-leaning media moguls would be inspiring if it wasn't so downright terrifying. So here's our next stop on the journey, politics. Now my hope is that this part of my talk can be delivered without bias, in a time frame where this topic is particularly fraught with divisive commentary. But when I look out in the world and see where IA is being practiced, but without that name, I think first to political ideology. Specifically, the journey that academic and research terms take on their way to being in the hands of spin doctors who are working to craft the perfect way for that information to be consumed by the masses. Did you know that if something rhymes, people are more likely to believe it? Yeah. Alliteration is another way to make something seem more trustworthy. Do you know that if you share something that's untrue and then immediately send a retraction, people will still believe the original thing more often than they will have consumed the retraction? Did you know that there are people out there who are currently making websites for fake local news brands because they know that headlines seen through those kinds of sites feel more authentic, even if it's not your town, even if it's a town you've never heard of before? These are all tricks of the trade when it comes to propaganda. And you know what good propaganda has? Excellent information architecture. Or, as The Atlantic recently put it, disinformation architecture. So I want to take a look at one of these ontological war stories and see what happened with an especially fraught term over the last 50 years. And that term is global warming. Over the last 50 years, there has been a slow ontological shift around the language that we collectively use to talk about our sustained impact on the world around us. And on the way, we have experienced everything from dinner table squabbles to knock-down, drag-out policy disagreements. And the stake for agreement is fairly high. It's just the timeline on which the human species might be pushed out of our comfort level living on the planet. As the kids would say, no big deal. So, let's dig into this. In the 1970s, there was a different term that was used primarily for the study of human impact on the climate. It was called inadvertent climate modification. Sexy, right? In an article by NASA entitled "What's in a Name," it was described as a term that, while clunky and dull, was an accurate reflection of the state of knowledge. At this point in time, many scientists accepted that human activities could cause climate change, but they did not know which direction that change might take. Industrial emissions of tiny airborne particles called aerosols might actually cause cooling, while greenhouse gas emissions could cause warming. It was a standoff. It needed more research and more time to be determined what exactly was going on. The term global warming saw its first use as a question in 1975 in an article by geochemist Wallace Brucker of Columbia. It was titled "Climate Change, Are We on the Brink of Pronounced Global Warming?" Question mark. Later in 1979, a study was published by Joel Charney of MIT for the National Academy of Science on carbon dioxide's impact on climate, and it indicated that the temperature of the Earth's surface was indeed increasing. In the Charney report, when referring to surface temperature change, Charney used Bronker's term, global warming. But when discussing the many other changes that might be experienced by increasing carbon dioxide, Charney used climate change. So what does this mean? This means that there were now two terms to teach the public about this all-important subject. One whose purpose was to indicate the climate is indeed changing based on our actions, and the other to communicate that we now have significant proof that the surface temperature of the Earth is increasing. Now, during the late 80s, one more term entered the lexicon, one that maybe you've never even heard of: global change. This term was meant to encompass many other kinds of change in addition to climate change that might result from the rising surface temperature of the Earth. This term was approved and made part of the official controlled vocabulary of researchers working in this space, but not until 1989. Now, before it could take hold as the primary term, as scientists had intended it, global warming became the dominant popular term in June of 1988 when NASA scientist James E. Hansen testified in Congress about climate, specifically referring to global warming, this time not as a question. So this is fascinating to me. This is a story of information architecture. This is a story about the slow and deliberate establishment of a controlled vocabulary. But it's also a story about all too common instances when a controlled vocabulary is ignored by users because the nuance is lost on them, or because the approach doesn't make sense to them in terms of their experience with the problem space. Honest question: how many of you have dealt with this reality when establishing a controlled vocabulary at your job? I see hands. Yep. I mean, I once had to go so far as to wear a gym whistle and blow it every time a client said a retired term, for months after the controlled vocabulary was, quote, approved. The truth is that the public doesn't care about using the right term, and nor should they. That simply is not their job. They are rightfully worried about bigger things than semantics, like their children growing up in a world that is increasingly pushing back against decades of our collective lack of care. So what's so bad about getting this term wrong? It's just semantics, right? Well, it turns out that in this specific case, the scientific swirl around establishing these terms is being singled out as a proof point for dissent. It's the crack in the information architecture about this subject that propagandists have identified as a weakness of clarity to exploit. Because they know that the lack of information creates information, and that a decade is a really long time to not have agreed to words for a concept with so much importance. And because they know that if they point out a seeming lack of clarity from even 30 plus years ago, they can create enough public disillusionment towards the scientific community to get their way. All you have to do is have a simple conversation with a self-proclaimed climate change denier to realize that this seemingly tiny slip of ontological dissemination has contributed so majorly to the Sharknado of misinformation swirling around about this important topic. I will never forget the first time I had a climate denier family member argue so emphatically about the fact that they still didn't know if the Earth was warming or cooling, so global warming is not to be believed. There is seemingly no way to convince them otherwise. So we have since agreed not to discuss it at all. Some of you probably have similar agreements in your families. But I don't know about you, but the idea of what his Facebook feed looks like or his targeted Google advertisements are absolutely terrifies me. Because we now not only have access to all of the information at our fingertips, we also have the ability to micro-target people based on incredibly creepy amounts of profiling data about them. The effects of this are being studied in many contexts, many closely resembling the work that I've done as an information architect to understand the various impacts of different labels on a user's experience. In a recent study, it was found that the more liberal-minded the participant, the more they pay attention to words like climate. Another study from back in 2014 indicated that people felt a heightened sense of anxiety when encountering the term global warming when compared with the term climate change. I can imagine that the findings decks from these studies became immediate appendices for propagandists looking to improve their approach. So the important question for the IA community is this. Is this result attributable to a failure of information architecture, or are we comfortable with the idea that this divisiveness is actually a success of information architecture? Could it be that the propaganda machines of the radicalized parts of our political systems have exploited a wishy-washy lack of widely accepted controlled vocabulary as an inroad to take a well-researched topic and, for lack of a better term, throw shade all over it? This matters. This is real. IA is everywhere. There is an IA element to everything. Our brains, our culture, our whole freaking world is being shaped by these seemingly small information architecture decisions that are made by just a few people and understood by fewer still. If this issue, which is currently so top of mind, is not significant enough an example to remind us that language matters, I don't know what could. In writing this talk, I question including this example for the sheer reason of its being controversial and hard to talk about. But in the end, I couldn't ignore it. It's not only an almost perfect lesson that information can be created by the lack, or in this case, swirl of information, but it's perhaps a needed reminder that IA can be practiced to help people, but it can also be practiced to manipulate people. So we've talked about a lot today, from frozen peas to melting icebergs, but I hope you're walking away from this talk with permission to make information architecture bigger. Permission to see IA all around you. Permission to point at examples of information architecture and teach your children about its successes and failures in the world around them. Permission to hear about IA problems in your local community and talk about them as IA problems. I think we have spent far too many years snickering about bad restaurant menu IA and poor form design, and not enough time getting this important information into the hands of the right people. The people who make things that real people interact with all day, every day. Do we really want to look back on this community in 10 years and realize that we made IA into something that only billion-dollar companies can make practical use of? I don't want to walk into that reality. I don't want to wake up to that future. And I hope neither do you. But that's where we're headed, friends. Unless we pull up and look at this opportunity in front of us and do something different. Information architecture is part of the human experience, whether anyone is paying attention to it or not. And we are the people that get to decide what happens next. So, your move. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if Dan will give me the time. I know we're running behind, so does anybody have anything? Yes, right there.
So you blame the package designer for the instructions on the keys?
I do not blame the packaging designer. My theory on it is that the packaging designer actually doesn't exist and that pea bag was designed by an algorithm that puts together pieces of packaging for lots of products, because that was obviously not specified for peas. But I don't know who's in charge of the packaging department and who writes that content, but it is truly, truly terrible. So, yeah. Yep.
Clearly readable. Right.
Yeah, it was on the label.
Oh, so great, even better. 2 grown women couldn't find it. Oh well.
It was right below the red circle, or in kilowatts.
Cool. Math, fun. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk, Abby. I'm wondering if you have positive examples of, in your experience, seeing IA become called out very specifically, but moving into kind of larger realms of strategy and systems within organizations, within other examples in our society that kind of show us a direction in how you're thinking about information architecture.
Yeah, there's been some really amazing work, specifically in the controlled vocabulary area. The team at 18F has really been pushing for humane content standards, and so they've published a lot in terms of how government organizations can treat language in a more humane way, and published a lot of really interesting work in that direction. I see companies that are doing really interesting IA work and good IA work all over the place. I think that the ones that I'm worried about are the ones that are doing IA without knowing that they are and pretending it's not a thing they need to focus on or invest any talent or time into. That's, I think, where the main things fall down. Yeah. Yep.
So you said that you thought about not including this in your talk today. What other, not controversial, but what other problems would you have given as an example?
Oh, you want to know all the controversial things that didn't end up in the deck? Oh, lady, find me later. Yeah. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Let's try to use microphones for questions, just so everyone can hear. Thanks.
So I teach undergraduates about cognition, and one thing I find a problem is that most people don't understand information, leave alone information architecture. Yes. Do you have thoughts about that?
Oh my goodness, thank you for asking that question. He's not a plant. I did not plant him to ask that question. Yes, there's a huge conundrum in teaching students about information because information is not content. Is that? Nope, just blank faces. Okay, so information is in our heads. It's the interpretation of what we are experiencing, meaning mine is different than yours, it's different from yours, it's different from yours. Content is the things that we're all experiencing. So the deck that I just presented, the words that came out of my mouth, that's content. The thing that you're left with when you leave this talk, that's information. And that's way slippery, right? So like students get super uncomfortable with the idea that we can't just like directly plant things into people's brains. It's like, well, if I write this grammatically correct and it makes sense to me, then it'll make sense to other people. The thing that we run into is that the content does not always end up as the information that was intended. And there's lots of examples of that. I was working with a client once that hid their price for their product because they thought that that would make them seem less pushy. Instead, it made them seem really expensive, right? That was the information that they created through the content choices that they had. Excellent question. I'd love to talk more about that too. Yes?
What does culture play in the standardization of information architecture? We seem to talk about being inclusive and being humane.
Yeah.
But as a Colombian myself, I feel like sometimes the standardization here in the US leaves some people out.
Huh, yeah, some.
You know, how as designers do we design things better that actually feel inclusive, cultural aspect?
Yep. Whew. Well, first, vote. Like, definitely vote, because that's a big part of it. Like, if you're going to change the system that we're in, all of your voices need to be heard. So that's number one. Two is like, pull up. Right? If you're sitting there doing design work with blinders on and you're focused on getting through your day, getting through your week, getting through this job, getting that promotion, whatever it is, and you're just blindly doing things without understanding how it's affecting the world, you're doing it wrong, right? Pull up, look at what you're doing, and ask questions, say no, and always assume best intentions, right? Sometimes the person who's asked you to do something that is going to be hurtful to whatever users you're designing for doesn't understand that it'll be hurtful. They can't see that second, third step from where you're at right now. Be the person who can show them that and assume the best intention that once they see it, they're going to come onto your side of belief that that's not the right thing to do. So be brave. That's my best advice for pretty much life. Yeah. All right, one more question, then we're done.
Yes, you had mentioned that it's almost like the demise of information architecture as you were talking about it. But do you see in certain areas where we're actually seeing it, the importance of it is so valuable? For example, machine learning and artificial intelligence, where you're seeing it's so methodical to understand it, to be able to be effective.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know what your thoughts of where you see it growing, gathering more prominence, and then hopefully spreading to other areas.
Yeah, I think that machine learning and artificial intelligence are both really interesting examples because they're both things that have emerged in a technologist direction and have kind of hit a wall of needing that human understanding part. So I feel like right now there's a lot of IAs that are working in that space and trying to figure out like how are we going to deal with this? Because you know, when all of a sudden one of the users you're trying to understand is a black box that you cannot understand, the complexity ramps up quite a bit. I'm really interested right now in sort of what the implications are for IAs in focusing on the ethical trajectory of those technologies. Like how do we make sure that when machines are making decisions that they're not making decisions that are bad for humans to actually experience? And I see a lot of companies that are falling down on that. You see a lot of social media products that have been called out for algorithmic cruelty. A lot of those with a focus on information architecture could have been avoided. So, yeah. Okay. Whew. Whew, that was a lot, you guys. Thank you so much. Boston, you're awesome. And I'll be around all day.
Well, thank you so much, Abby. While we're transitioning, a couple of quick announcements. So one, we're going to make a couple changes with the cameras to try to get an additional camera angle, so that'll just take a minute.
Hi,
Meanwhile, yeah, I see people in the back. There are some seats up here in the front row. There's some empty seats throughout, so please make yourself comfortable. I'll just give everyone a minute to move around. And then we will have a longer bathroom break after the next session. And then we'll go into the 11 a.m.
All right. Is this the one?
Oh.
I mean, that's the one that fit. Connected?
Oh,
No, it's not connected.
There's some extra ones here.
There's just like too many things here.
I'll try this one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I can just take that other extra cable away.
All right, I'm ready. And microphone is this one, or was there a one to wear?
Where did Abby go? Abby, do you still have that microphone?
Yes, she does. It looks like it.
Can we take that microphone? I think that was working better than the one I had.
Yeah, I don't want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got our books here.
We gotta put it up higher. That's the problem.
Yeah.
These things are not. They're not designed for humans.
Just ran.
Okay. All right. Is the microphone working? I don't hear it. I have to push something. Oh yeah, that's right. Just turned it off. Okay. Oh, okay. I don't know. Hello? Is this microphone working? It doesn't sound like it. Can't work well with her. Because it's on.
Can you hand me the microphone?
Okay.
Testing. I think you just have to be really close to it. We also have try turning up a little bit. We also have handheld.
Yeah.
For that,
Okay. But I have to hold it. How did it work with her? Testing. Weird.
Really loudly.
Okay. Or I have to hold it. All right, I'll let you decide when to start.
Okay. But I can give you this as an extra in case you want to pick it up in the middle.
Yeah, it's right. That might be better. Okay, but I shouldn't have both going. No, I think it will. I'll talk now.
We'll see how it goes. I'll just leave it up there. Just switch off right now.
Okay.
Testing. All right.
Let's get started in a minute. Please take your seats. All right. I'm very excited to introduce Heather Hedden. Heather Hedden is a taxonomist. She's been a practicing taxonomist for 24 years in many different organizations and as an independent consultant with Hedden Information Management. She has worked as a taxonomist in a library database publisher, a search software company, a wind energy company, a knowledge management consultancy, and an educational publisher. So I think that gives you, that's another way of thinking about the breadth of applications of information architecture and taxonomy and the many contexts where they're used. And she is also the author of this book, The Accidental Taxonomist. And we will also be raffling one off a little bit later. Take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, for inviting me. All right, I've got my little introduction here too. And I've done taxonomies both for internal, external, and I do also teaching. I do an online course and workshops, and so kind of go through that. So here's my outline. I like how Abby did mention taxonomies, controlled vocabularies, and then I'm thinking, well, a taxonomist isn't exactly a kind of information architect, but maybe taxonomy is a narrower term to information architecture, or is it a related term? So I deal with controlled vocabularies, but also the relationships. So let's talk about those different approaches. What is a taxonomy for? So, there are terms, controlled vocabulary, but it's used to tag or index the content. We're talking about content to make it easier to be found, so then it becomes information when people get it. And it's better than just search alone. So what's important is that the taxonomy actually serves as an intermediary between people and content. And therefore, the taxonomy should be constructed to suit the content and the audience in a particular situation. There are kind of two different views and approaches to commercial taxonomies these days. One is you can think of a more traditional, the hierarchy, the structure, relationship of categories, broader, narrower, guiding users through a tree structure. Or you might think of metadata and tags and something that supports search, maybe refinements and filters. So I have these kind of 1, 2 here. Actually, I'd like to get a show of hands. How many of you have kind of more familiarity or experience, or think, when you think of taxonomy, think of number 1, the tree structure? Okay. And how many think more of number 2, the tags and supporting search? Actually, it looks pretty even, and then like a third of you didn't answer at all. That's okay. But I like it that we're seeing both here. So I have some examples here. Here's number 1, the hierarchies, the classification, the classified ads now coming online, top categories, narrower categories. We see it in e-commerce. This is a good example. We see, top categories on the left, office supplies is selected, and then you get out to the left, the second level and the third level. So those are implementations of the hierarchies. A different implementation then is of the search terms. If you type into a search box, what you see here are then matching against the controlled vocabulary taxonomy. I mean, these are obviously not popular searches, because when we have a word and comma, population, comma, male, percentage, total population, of course that's a controlled vocabulary term. That's not a popular search term. Another example is having, someone did a search here in the Bureau of Labor Statistics for retirement, and then on the left, different refinements. These are also different terms used that counts for them, the controlled vocabulary. Finally, a more simple example, if you go to the Internet Movie Database, there are different ways to search, but there's also these browse interesting keywords. So these are terms not in any hierarchical structure, but just additional terms from a controlled vocabulary. So again, what is a taxonomy then? We see that there are two different aspects to it. It has both, the controlled list of terms and that it's organized. So it's, as a taxonomy is a kind of control vocabulary based on concepts that are unambiguous. So it's not just words and phrases. Each concept should be clear to the users what it means. And that the terms are arranged in some kind of structure, where there are hierarchies, categories, facets to organize them. Just wait, where does the word taxonomy come from? So from the ancient Greek, meaning arrangement, and nomia, meaning method. So there is that aspect of structure, arrangement, that comes to the word taxonomy as a kind of controlled vocabulary. And so that aspect of classification is still relevant to the definition of taxonomies, although a taxonomy is not merely a classification. So I mentioned hierarchical and faceted. So you see a hierarchical example on the left. This is the Integrated Public Services Vocabulary of the United Kingdom, which is open, public, anybody can take it, so that's why I copied it. And then on the right, I made up this little faceted taxonomy for looking for jobs. So facets here, career level, function, industry, those are different aspects or sides or dimensions of a query. So there's structure too, but it's not the same kind of multi-level hierarchy necessarily. So we talked about classification. You're probably familiar with the Dewey Decimal System, which is numeric, but is a classification a taxonomy? And I explored this recently in a blog post. I mean, we see some weird things in here, like other literature and history of other areas and the numbers. So I looked into it more, and it's not the same, and this is kind of my side-by-side comparison. Of course, the classification system has codes and a taxonomy doesn't, but it goes really beyond that. You know, we don't usually see the synonyms in a classification system when we do in taxonomies, but a classification system aims at kind of balanced coverage of a domain area, where a taxonomy is to support what's needed. I mean, and it may be unbalanced hierarchically. It's not trying to be a kind of neat structure. And so the classification system is designed just for browsing from the top down, whereas a taxonomy can be browsed, it can be searched, it can be displayed in different ways, as we've seen. And then a classification system is built kind of independent of content, but for a specific subject area, where taxonomies are built for a specific set of content, usually. And then there's limited area for expansion with classification systems because of those codes. They might be a little bit space in the numbers for some more, whereas taxonomies are more flexible and expandable, extensible. They can grow. As we see in classification systems, there'll be a category for other or not else for classified, and taxonomies don't. I also thought about comparing taxonomies to navigation, because navigation systems are an important part of information architecture. And sometimes people think of that, yeah, we have some hierarchy of menus and a sitemap, so that's a taxonomy, right? Well, not exactly. So the navigation is really built for well, I said taxonomies are custom built. They can be reused or adapted and changed over time, where navigation is really built for a specific implementation. And it reflects the sitemap structure, whereas the organization of terms in a taxonomy reflects the terms themselves, independent of the content, what is broader or narrower. And the labels, the names in a navigation are based more on page titles, whereas the labels in the taxonomy for the terms are really based on concepts. The navigation, again, is just for top-down, and taxonomies can be accessed different ways. The navigation, it's limited, really. You don't want to go more than 2 or 3 levels. A taxonomy, you can definitely go more levels deep. A key difference is that navigation is there's one-to-one of a label and a page. I mean, maybe a landing page and branch out there for a lot more other pages, whereas a taxonomy concept, a term, is tagged and linked to multiple pages, documents, whatever. So that's a very key difference. And as such, the navigation is more limited in size. It doesn't even cover all the pages, whereas a taxonomy can be large And it can also cover all the pages because each term in the taxonomy will be tagged to multiple pages so that none of the pages are left out. There may be some bias in navigation as what is included, what's important, whereas taxonomies should be more neutral. Navigation is not quite as flexible in updating as taxonomies. And finally, the navigation is about paths and links, not about metadata, where taxonomy is usually, it is metadata. You assign a taxonomy term to a content item, it becomes metadata on that content. I've mentioned some uses of taxonomies. There's kind of really a longer list. Yeah, that topic category browsing, which enables the user to explore. Then there's search, matching search strings to concepts. There could be type ahead, search suggest. And then there's discovery. So the user may be looking for something specific, or they're exploring, but the other is they stumble upon something that they weren't expecting to find, and that's good too, what they're looking for. Other uses of taxonomy are to filter results or sort results, especially if they're in tables and columns. It can be used for content management workflow, dealing with rights and audience and records retention, or even metadata, not so much to find information, but to identify it, allowing to compare and analyze content. And of course, consistent tagging too on the other end. So a taxon, so then I'm going to focus now on this idea of categories and tags, because those brings together those two different aspects of taxonomy. So a single taxonomy may have both approaches, organize and control vocabularies, but sometimes you might actually have two in the same implementation, the same site, at the same time. So you have some broader categories for classification and the tags to support search. And these are both familiar to users. The categories might be displayed as virtual folders, and tags associated with content might look like little tags. And the same content can be managed with both. So some examples here, these are 3 different screenshots. The one on the left is a content management system, al fresco. You see it has categories, it has tags, right in the same display. This other one from PicMonkey, which is where you can create images. They have category and popular tags. And then in the metadata of Microsoft Office applications, categories and keywords tags. So the user can have both at the same time, which might be a little confusing. Oh yeah, so I mean, I have a blog in WordPress that also has categories with a little folder and tags. So I had to decide, well which am I going to call a category and which am I going to call a tag? Because I also have it in Blogspot, which only has one, and then I can. Okay. So when to create categories instead of tags, or in addition. So if there seems to be some dominant, for the users, there are dominant means of categorizing, if they're all thinking about some big content type or discipline or brand, then it might make sense to have some broader categories too. If the same users are usually going to the same category, they have some kind of go-to folder. This might be for internal users. If the files stay in the repository, I mean, somebody explained to me this with the content management, rather than travel from one system to the other. Because if the documents are going from one system to another, you want to have metadata on the content. Also, the taxonomy, that's rather small because there might not be the opportunity to display synonyms, variants with the categories. And there's maybe a desire to have some hierarchy, 2 or 3 level hierarchy of categories, and the content management system metadata doesn't support hierarchy. Or if there's problems getting people to tag. Yeah, they have to put it in the category, and maybe tagging is optional. Yeah, for internal users. And if conversations with users show that they really do want the categories. I mean, these are reasons that you might consider to have them. Some more comparison of categories and tags. You kind of think of like what buckets the information goes into, content goes into, I shouldn't say information, versus what topics are contained within the content. What is this? What is it about? You can think of categories as like a table of contents and tags like an index. Categories tend to be more broad and tags tend to be more specific, and therefore you tend to have a limited number of categories and more tags. Another thing is that then categories are mutually exclusive. You know, it's either this or either that, whereas tags, they can overlap because these are topics. And categories may be hierarchical. Tags, they can be maybe not. They could be less structured, and it's more control over the categories and tags. Now, when I'm talking about tags, I'm not limiting myself to a controlled vocabulary here. You could have uncontrolled keyword tags as well. So just to explain that. Whereas the categories are controlled and tags may be, and so we're talking about overlapping things here. So that's where their categories are pre-planned. If it's ad hoc, we have additional tags. We can have a controlled vocabulary of tags and allow users to add some additional keywords if they wish. Now, with these two different approaches, and having both at the same time, there are problems. Because you could have users have an inconsistent experience of having certain terms or labels used in categories and different ones used in tags, and they're going on at the same time. Another problem is that if you're choosing the wrong design, if it's supposed to be tags and you're getting into a kind of a hierarchy classification scheme. And finally, if you are only having a single taxonomy and you have to have features of both categories and then more specific tags to support search, there might be some compromises, and it might be too detailed for hierarchies or not enough detailed for search. So these are just some things to keep in mind. Okay, so my next topic here is on developing a taxonomy. I mean, I can go into great detail on this, so I'll just kind of hit some high points that you need to consider. As I said, that since the taxonomy links users to content, you need to consider the content and consider the users as sources for the terms and labels. And if it's public facing, then you might also consider what else is similar, their competitors, what their websites are. Generally avoid external taxonomies for a license. They exist, but in most cases they're not right. You'd have to change them. It's too much work, or any standard library classification. If you involve SMEs, subject matter experts, or other stakeholders to give ideas, you need to give them good instructions and explain what this taxonomy is and how it will be used. Otherwise, they might create some detailed classification scheme which is not needed. And finally, someone said, well, for synonyms, why don't you use Roget's thesaurus? I can import it into our system and we have them all there. Well, there's several reasons. First of all, that's just words, not phrases, and it has other parts of speech that aren't nouns. But most importantly, it's these are like words that can be synonymous, similar if you're an author and you want to have a little more color and you want to have something that's not quite the same but different. Whereas your synonyms in a controlled vocabulary or taxonomy have to be equivalent in all cases of the content that you have. So steps in building a taxonomy, kind of at a high level. You might have a brainstorming workshop if it's internally used and you have internal stakeholders, but definitely some interviews of those who would be doing the tagging and other stakeholders, kind of a content or audit of analysis of the content that will be tagged, review of any existing vocabularies. Search logs are very useful. You can see what people have been putting in and searching. These are terms. They might turn out to be your synonyms, but they're still good. And then you build your taxonomy and then you review it with the stakeholders and get feedback. There should also be some testing, use testing, and very important is taxonomy governance and documentation, which basically, while I put it at the end, this is something you build along the way. Questions come up, you decide how are we going to do this, and then you get guidance, your own kind of house policy about how this taxonomy should be style and how it should be updated and who should update it and how it should be tagged. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit about displays of taxonomies for users. So the hierarchical kind, we kind of see three different formats these days: the expandable tree, one level per page, and flyout subcategories. So I have a few examples for each. So the expandable tree type, the user kind of clicks and they get the next level, next level. The one on the far right, I don't even think exists anymore. It's an old one of USA Today. You can see they just got too many terms that way. It's a little clunky. So we tend to see this. Yeah, the advantages and disadvantages. It allows the user, of course, to explore multiple layers, and it accommodates inconsistent numbers per term. So you don't need to have a nice, well-balanced taxonomy. You could have 1 or 2 narrower terms here, and 5 here, and deep, deep, deep over there, and that's fine. And it's good for deep taxonomies, but it's not really sufficient for very large taxonomies, and it is a little more complex to implement too. So I usually see those on kind of internal systems, not on the web, because it just kind of takes time to load. So the one level per page, you can see this is from Amazon. If I went back to books, categories of books, I selected reference books, and then I get a whole nother page comes up with reference, and I can select dictionaries and the sources, and I get another page. So that's the one level per page. So there you can see you get a lot, it can display at one level, and it's good for large volumes of content, and it also gives the additional space to display content. It works well with polyhierarchy is when a term has more than one broader term, so it can show up more in one place. But the users only see one level at a time. They may see there's a little breadcrumb trail where it says they went back, but they can't visualize quite as much. And it's good when you've got a lot of terms at the same level, but if you only have a couple, it's not quite as suitable. So then the flyout subcategories. This is a grocery store, actually in the United Kingdom, but I like the way this one worked. So you see, you got your first level on the left, select fresh food, and then that, the picture went away, but we still have that top level of the bakery food, the top is still there, and then we got the next level. And then we can select another one, cheese, and we go out and we go to the third level. But the previous levels are kept there, so that's pretty nice. Another example where it's not implemented quite as well, journals. These are kind of open source scholarly journals. We have 3 levels here, but you can see that there's just not a lot of space here. I mean, there's the scroll bar, we're still at the top, and there's a lot to scroll through. And then they're trying to fit four levels of depth, and only 3 of them are showing. So I found this one not very good to use. They didn't make good use of space. But it's nice that users can visualize and see both levels of hierarchy, and they can back up. But of course, as you saw, it's not good for a very large taxonomy, and it's not good if you've got more than 3 levels. Maybe they could have fit 4, but that doesn't fit in everybody's window. Okay, so that's hierarchies, and then something on facets. I think we're all familiar with facets from e-commerce. Here's 4 different examples from e-commerce where you see facets for clothes of size range, specific size, color, sleeve length, fabric, style, and for books, and for software, and for furniture. So they are very customized for the content. And you see some other features here about checkboxes. You can check multiple ones, and there's other space to display. And then internally, I mean, this is kind of on intranets, you can have for people inside an organization, you can search for them and filter by department, job title, office location, and internal documents by document type, item type, project, even sprint when it had to do with software development, and other types here. Okay. So it's very, very common to see. The advantage is that it supports this kind of complex queries by users as like Boolean searching this and this, but they don't have to know it's Boolean searching. And allows control of the refinement. They can narrow and broader. And it's very nice that it's suitable for both novice and expert users. But it's only suitable for content that has shared some similar aspects to them that you can create these facets. And it's, you can't fit in a really large topical taxonomy very well. And finally, it requires thorough tagging or indexing, because everything has to be tagged with all of those different aspects, not just 1 or 2 topics. And my tips for facet design, keep them limited, maybe like 5 to 6, and they can be displayed within a different, the order is just logical. And the number of terms that display, again, not too many within it. Usually they're kept small. There might be a scroll box. And I've also felt like maybe around 12 or so logical order, and then more than that, alphabetical order is better. It's possible to have a second level of hierarchy within a facet. It may work, may not, and I'll show some of that later. Again, the number of facets, where here I had said like maybe, well, in the range of 3 to 8, but 5 to 6 is ideal. This screenshot here shows it just continues. This is like this next one. It went way down below. This is from a SharePoint of an organization I was consulting for, where there were 9 different refinements or facets, and by default, they were all open to the first 6 terms, so that topics was like below the scroll of the page. We couldn't even filter that. So that's something to consider. Maybe try to get your important ones up top, or not create so many. I mean, do people really need to limit by file size? I mean, at the beginning, maybe as afterwards, but not at the beginning. So facets can be kind of post-search filters or initial browse or both. You can display a short list, and then they can expand. The ability to have users select from checkboxes, including other metadata that's not taxonomy, such as date or author or price or something. Keep that in mind. That will also take space. And how specific the facets should be. So here are some more examples of possibilities. You can have them all pretty collapsed. You could have, here are the slider bar for price, color swatches for color. That's kind of fun. And you can see some have checkboxes, some of them have numbers in parentheses showing the number of items. So all these different features to do. And then finally, combining taxonomies with facets. You can do this 2 different ways. One is you have facets with a hierarchy in one of them, or you have a hierarchy of topics, and then when you get more specific, introduce the facets. So in the first example, this one from the libraries of North Carolina State University, you can see the different facets here for library location, resource type. I collapsed them so you can see, but call number, this is the Library of Congress subject headings, is of course quite a hierarchy of classification. They fit all that into a facet with the little arrows going in and out. Another example that's probably not so good from the World Bank, this is public, where they have indented, a broader term is agriculture, and then different kinds of agriculture, and broader term of law and business, and specific kinds indented, all within a box, a scroll box for the facet topic. And then we have the facet language. So of course, the problem of having 2-column scrolling is not so good. But then the other way, where you start with categories and go to facets, back to Amazon again, we have books. And then when I get more specific, computer and technology books and databases and big data and data mining, you see the facets, the show refined by. We then get facets for platform. And which is what computer platform for and audience, beginners, seniors, advanced and power users, kids and teens. I think beginners and seniors together. Okay. Okay, so here's my final bit of tips here. Back to the subject of vocabulary. Be careful of what you call things, because I've seen this kind of confusing. What does related term mean? Does it mean that these terms are actually related, like in a thesaurus, broader, narrower, related, or does it mean these are also terms that have been tagged to this, or these are also popular searches, or top terms? Somebody even asked me this because I was telling them in an exercise, suggest how many top terms are, and she thought, well, maybe does that mean the most popular terms? Versus does it mean the highest, in a hierarchy, in the top, the top broadest terms? Keywords is used differently. It can mean, are they from a controlled vocabulary from the taxonomy, or are they not? Are they any search string, or are they a folksonomy, which are uncontrolled? And finally, navigation, because I said navigation and taxonomy are different, but sometimes I've seen it referred to navigating the taxonomy Or, does that mean navigating the taxonomy, or does it mean navigating the site, or navigating the content? So that can all be a little confusing. So that's it. I have a few slides on resources. I'm going to put these slides on my website so you can have access to them. And I'll take a few questions if we have time.
Well, we've got time for questions. Just a couple of volunteers have microphones, so just make sure you take a microphone so everyone can hear you.
Yeah, I talked a little fast because I know we were short on time.
So you showed a bunch of examples of sort of better and worse execution along with the various forms of taxonomy. How would you communicate to a client that only really thinks in terms of the final execution, whether the work that needs to be done is to invest resources in refining the taxonomy versus investing resources in refining the execution based on that taxonomy?
Okay, that's a good question. I mean, because I have been, I put myself out there as a taxonomist, so they asked me to do the taxonomy part. So if they're asking me, then it is really dealing with the taxonomy rather than the execution. But it is still something I point out because I have to work with people who are, especially the implementation with search, which is, I don't know, I don't always understand it, but I know that those are conversations I have to have. I can't just stay in the world of taxonomy. I definitely have to figure out how is the search going to work, and how is the user interface going to, there are limitations sometimes with, I'd like to do the taxonomy a certain way, but I see, oh, well, the user interface has certain limitations that have already been determined. I'm not sure if I completely answered your question. Okay. Yeah, all right.
Hi. I'm sorry. Alex Law. Thank you, Heather, for your presentation. I had a question in regards to the technology advancements right now. We're seeing more and more technology being developed to put in the hands of the consumers tools to design and create things. It may be architectural design for consumers to be able to design a shed in their backyard. So it gathers information so that it helps them be correct and not be wrong. And so machine learning is a big aspect of the taxonomy and classification, to be able to categorize information and know when a consumer puts some information in, the machine is going to bounce back other information to make it easier for that individual. So my question to you is, where are you seeing taxonomy, classification involves, I think, sometimes a combination of both. Where do you see the growth area in this space?
Yeah, well, I usually hear about machine learning and artificial intelligence with respect to the auto tagging. So the taxonomy is usually still manually created, but when it comes to the tagging to content, that's where we're seeing, or have been seeing, it continues a lot more automation, and there are different ways to do that. It's certainly with text analytics, but now we're getting into images too. There could be, discerning what's in an image and what it should be tagged with. Yeah, there are tools that will suggest taxonomy terms. So taking a corpus of content and then bringing up these are very common terms. You should, but when it comes to, the final refinement is still manual in creating a taxonomy that's really user friendly. I mean, a machine can't do that.
So I've been told before that your website shouldn't have FAQs. It should be an FAQ. And in terms of a taxonomy, what kind of solutions would you recommend to kind of solve those kinds of problems, where it's not necessarily that the user knows exactly what they're looking for, but they know the question? Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, I hadn't heard that you shouldn't have an FAQ. Because you wonder whether the user is going to type into the search box FAQ, right? They want to look for that. I don't know. Can you explain a little further what your question is, though?
for example, in terms of if someone is having like some sort of like stomach pain, and you know, it could be a variety of different things, but it could be, you know, a multitude of different things throughout a website. And how do you kind of, I think it kind of might go along with the machine learning. And I guess my ultimate question is there some sort of hybrid between search and maybe some other type of taxonomy display?
Yeah, I mean, taxonomy works with search. I mean that you can have it give relevance to this taxonomy tag terms first before any other keywords found in. I mean, that's one way. I mean, another way is that having the user type in, like I showed that one example with. I think it was the World Bank, but it was that's suggesting terms from the taxonomy, not merely popular search terms. Yeah, and they're not searching, they didn't intend to search the taxonomy, but they're suggested terms. Usually users would just go to search first anyway, rather than browse a taxonomy or go to some advanced search or whatever. But if they get a bunch of results, and as I said, instead of the facets at the beginning, you can have what are post-search refinements. So they get a bunch of, retrieve a lot of results, and in the margin, it will show what are the topics or the document types or what other aspects have been tagged to this whole set of content. So if you want to get a little more focused, because the result set's too much, then you select from the term there. So those are the different ways that taxonomies integrate with search.
Thank you.
Okay.
I was just wondering whether you have any resources for existing established taxonomies that you might tap?
Okay. There are directories, and I said, usually it's best to make your own. There are directories of taxonomies, control vocabularies, glossaries, ontologies, that are available for license. Some are open source, some you have to pay quite a bit for. I mean, the two main one's called taxonomywarehouse.com, and another one, although it's a little out of date, it has quite a bit. Another one is BARTOC, B-A-R-T-O-C, which is the in Basel, Switzerland, Registry of Thesauri, Ontologies, and Classifications. It's actually quite a bit larger. And some of those you can, I think especially when it deals with science and medicine, there's a lot more open sharing of vocabularies there, because in established disciplines, academic and research disciplines, that's where sharing taxonomies is good. When you're doing something that's internal to your organization so your employees can find content, that's where you customize, okay? And we've got products that are going out. It's probably better still to customize because of your products and just see what your competitor sites are doing. And finally, if you have a faceted taxonomy, you might look into having a facet one facet, let's say, has to do with organizations or places that something exists and you take it. Okay?
Last one.
Okay.
Kevin Hatchor, thank you, Heather, for the great presentation. Just gonna squeeze two quick questions in there. The first is, you drew the differences between some IA elements and taxonomy, and I wanted to ask you if another way to think about taxonomy would be it's really an umbrella of all these different pieces. The second question would be, when it comes to organizing information, and we're looking at categories versus labels, or tags, excuse me, when we're displaying that information in the search for the users, which is the better approach, to show results per categories or to show results per tags? And an example of that would be, a user go on mass.gov, for example, to search for some health services, and they end up on the page on the human health and human services. But really what they're looking for is on the page for environmental health and environmental services. So the two services might be related, but they're belong in two different categories. So, would it be the better approach to show results based upon the categories of what they're looking for, or based on related items based on what they're looking for?
Okay. Well, categories would be a different way of kind of getting in. So if a user is given some categories, they can start that way, and then they know that they're looking for everything within that category. Others may just choose not to do that and just initiate a search. And then when they get results, the tags will be differentiated, which meaning of health, that it wouldn't just be a vague term health. The terms are specific enough. They may have some qualifier in parentheses saying, or they may say health and human services. So in that sense, the tags will help them differentiate, but also categories is basically another option for users to, if they want to go somewhere specific in a general area first. And I guess the answer to your first question, when you say taxonomies are broader, I mean, I don't see taxonomies as broader to information architecture. It's a part of information architecture, the field of taxonomies, as I said at the beginning. Okay, I think we're out of time, but I'll be around and you can ask me for another question.
Yes, sorry to... Thank you so much, Heather.
Okay.
At the IA conference this year, Andrew Hinton gave a presentation, and he said, let's get this straight. Navigation is not a menu on a website. Navigation is something people do. So the more I learned about all these different aspects of taxonomy and navigation and architecture, it really just expanded the way I thought about designing systems. I think Heather does have a copy of her book here. If you'd like to take a look at it, I recommend it. So before you get up, a few important announcements, and I just need a second to plug in. So we're going to have a 15-minute break, but before that, I'm going to give you instructions for both the next session and for lunch. Since some of you might not be back in the auditorium before lunch. We'll come back to the raffles this afternoon. So for our next session, we'll move this back and start at about 11:15. We'll have 3 sessions taking place. And I'll tell you where they are. So Marlene Tadros will be presenting not just presenting, but facilitating an activity in the Washburn Lounge, which is right upstairs. It's on the first floor of this building. There may be limited seating up there, depending on how things work out, so we'll see. Daryl Penta, is Daryl still in here? Oh, there he is. He will be in the Sherrill Library, so that is next door. If you exit this building, it's to the left as you're coming out of this building. That will be on the 3rd floor. It's pretty easy to find the stairs and elevators. And then third, the discussion with Priyama Barua, Tom Diamond, Allison Herrera, Kate Torado, and Tanya Schlatter will be right here in the auditorium. I'm super excited for all 3 of these. These are all awesome speakers, and they should be fascinating, and I wish I could be in all 3 places at once. Okay, so that'll start at 11:15, give or take a couple minutes. Then lunch. So everybody will be on their own for lunch. There are lots of places nearby. There are probably, I think, Rick Aborn compiled a list. There are probably 60 or 70 places nearby. But we're going to tweet out a list of recommended places to start with. If it's helpful, thanks to the volunteers who put that together. We'll tweet that. If you're looking for people to eat with, gather in the lobby of this building to find people. You are also you're welcome to eat anywhere or bring food back and sit here in the auditorium or upstairs in the lounge or the cafe. The cafe itself is, you can go to the cafe, but it is mostly for Leslie University students, so we don't want to overwhelm them. So just be conscious of that. And we'll meet back here at maybe, I don't know how long lunch will take, but let's try to get back here at 11:20, 11:25. I'm sorry, thank you. 1:20 to 1:25 for the afternoon sessions. And in the afternoon, again, these are amazing speakers. Please come back. I can't wait to hear them. If you are in the live stream, the next session and the afternoon will be at separate URLs, but that's all accessible from our webpage. So thanks. Take a break, use the restroom, make your way to the next room, or stay here, and see you in a few minutes. Thank you.
They're all great. You know, I want to go to all three just like you. I'm like, oh no, what do I do?
By the way, thank you to Todd and Nick for helping with all the AV and video and streaming. And I know that when you're doing that, you can't pay full attention to the program. So thanks for making that sacrifice. So I am going to introduce Tanya Slaughter, who is moderating the session, and then I think the speakers will introduce themselves. Tanya leads UX and UI work across product development teams at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University. And she also teaches interaction and information design at Northeastern University. She co-wrote visual usability principles and practices for designing digital applications and co-owned Nimble Partners, a UX design consulting firm, after holding leadership positions in design and communications at ATG, MIT, and Suffolk University. And I just want to show you the book real quick. This is Visual Usability. It's a really cool book. I just started reading it, and there are things in here that I'm like, you know, I thought of myself as a usability person, but there are things I've been trying to figure out for so long, and they're, you know, this explained it.
Cool.
So,
thank you.
Anyway, yeah, I think we're good to go.
We're good to go. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. And I just want to say double thank you to Dan, because the amount of work that he's done to organize this event is awesome. So thank you, and thank you to the sponsors and you guys for being here, and my very accomplished and diverse panelists. So the goal of this session is to talk about the IA element in practice. None of us have information architect in our title, and I would bet many of you don't as well. However, to the points that Abby Covert made, information architecture is extremely important if we are working with people, information, technology, interaction. It's a key part of what we do. So what we hope to do in this session is to bring what we do to light a little bit and name it. So This session is going to be a little bit of a mix of formal and informal. Pretty soon I'm going to hand it over to the panelists, and they're going to introduce themselves and kind of talk about a time that they felt like they were doing IA at work. And we'll have one more question, and then we're going to hopefully open it up to the audience. So if you can be thinking about any questions that you have for anyone up here, then we can have a great discussion. So I think with that, I am going to turn it over to Priyama Barua and take it away.
Thank you. So I'm Priyama Barua. I'm an Experience Strategy Director at MadPow. That might be a title that many are unfamiliar with. I still have trouble explaining it, even though I've been doing that for 5 years now. But in short, we try and understand the experience that customers want to have with the company, and then the strategy of the company, everything about the company, the way they price, the way they speak to their customers, are all designed around that customer experience. So to be able to do this, one of the methods that we use is service design. And that's something I'm going to be talking a lot about today. So you'll see that visual up on the screen that should hopefully help you understand what service design really is. So services are anything which is intangible, banking, finance, as well as service elements of actual physical products, so whether it's a laptop or a laundry device in your house. So service elements are often intangible. And what service designers do is try to concretize that into interactions or touch points. So whether that's digital, human, space, something that's printed out, a signage, just like this whole ecosystem of things that people are interacting with. And then we map out what are the processes that are happening, what are the people that the customer is coming into contact with. And also the props up there that you see, so the digital elements. So using this conversation, I started thinking about how service design and IA sort of fit together. And I realized that that quote by Richard Buchanan sort of sums it up, because service design really is trying to give people the right information at the right point of time so that they can do the task that they set out to do. Making sure that they know also where to find those tools to do that actual task. So I'll use that as a way to intro myself, just as that is the role that I play, and that is the perspective of IA that I'll be bringing to this conversation.
Great, thank you. But actually, before we move on, I mean, that quote and what you're describing sounds a lot to me like context, like you're providing the context. Do you think about it like that at all?
Absolutely, and context with the company, with the client, or with the product that we're thinking of, as well as the wider ecosystem. We chatted about this earlier. Context in service design is so difficult to really narrow down, because there's no end to it. The more you think about it, it just keeps widening from that inner circle of company to community to systems to government to, like, it just keeps widening.
It's big.
Yeah.
Okay, great. I'm gonna go ahead. Okay, Tom.
Hi, I'm Tom Diamond. I am a user experience designer. I work for AIR Worldwide. It is not an airline. It is applied insurance research, and as a user experience designer there, I help the company get their products ready to go in front of clients that need to do insurance analytics, helps them price their products. I've been with them for almost 4 years now. I've been working as a designer for about 25 years. In that time, there's always been a word or an acronym in front of that designer. Graphic designer, web designer, visual designer, and more recently in the last 7-8 years, UX designer. And I think when I finally, I came up through the advertising agencies after I finished my degree at Mass Art in illustration and art history. Had nothing to do with design per se. and came up through the advertising agencies in Boston, Greater Boston, a lot of startups, in-house creative services teams, and occasionally landing doing contract and freelance, and occasionally full-time, like where I am now. Back in 2000 was probably when I found myself doing UX for the first time. But like a lot of the stories I hear about anyone doing UX, and again, I'm going to probably be a little acronym-centric here. Much like Dan mentioned at the beginning, some of us may not count ourselves or call ourselves information architects, but we have deep connections to it. So again, a lot of my work is basically as a user experience designer. So I found myself doing UX, more by accident than anything else. I was working at Staples, working on their B2B e-commerce site, and because it wasn't Staples.com, the much sexier e-commerce site that everyone else wanted, it was a full team of designers and researchers and so forth, and I was basically the sole designer to help pull this thing together. So, and 20 years ago, I was still just coming out from the world of pure visual design and brochureware, if anyone remembers calling websites brochureware. And I'm just sticking up Post-it notes all over my cubicle and drawing on the windows and just trying to solve these design problems of getting the right information to people that needed to buy their office supplies for their fleets and their offices across the country. And I didn't even know I was doing UX at that point. I sort of found out sort of after the fact. And I found that tends to be a fairly typical, not uncommon at least, experience for a lot of fellow designers that they didn't know they were doing UX until someone told them. Then, so where is this subway picture coming from? The question we were asked to, think about was, when did you realize you were doing IA? And it's not so much about when, so I gave you my sort of moment back 20 years ago, but I find I'm doing IA or solving for the user experience all the time. This is just one that I found a little amusing for myself, that as I'm riding the orange line, I might have my headphones on, I might have my head in a book, maybe they're not announcing what stop you're at, and as a tall person, you might not see what stop you're at. And I was just thinking, you might crouch down and figure out, maybe I'll see something that will tell me, am I at State, am I at Downtown Crossing, I don't know. And then maybe there's only just an orange stripe and there's still no label. And you go, okay, I don't think I've missed my stop yet, because all these, they start to look the same after a while. The good news is I've never missed my stop. But what I'm doing in those moments, I find myself doing, is sort of solving the, well, wouldn't it be great if they had more of that, State, 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 or Downtown Crossing, all the way across, so there's no chance of missing it. Or maybe some tiles or paint job on the floor that would just DTX, let you know that you're at Downtown Crossing. So in my case, I might see the floor before I'm going to see some name across the top of the wall. So to wrap up on that, it's just something that I find myself doing more and more when I'm driving, when I'm on the train, solving UX, IA problems sort of almost instinctually at this point.
So it sounds like you're looking for markers, you're looking for additional markers, or there are markers missing in this context.
Well, very much so. And that's one other thing I want to kind of draw back to, sort of my roots in visual design, is the thread that sort of connects everything about what I've been doing, at least, is the art of communication. And it's what we as the practitioners are helping our products and applications communicate, but also communication's a two-way, hopefully a two-way exchange. And based on what we deliver, our users are communicating back to us. They're providing us some affirmation. They've clicked on the button that they need. We hope they would click on, that kind of thing. And with that, I'm thinking about how well are we listening. So that's something I hope I can share with you today, is that art of communication, how I apply it in my work.
It's cool, and I think of like the marker and the looking for the markers and you know, kind of the where am I, that directly relates to what Heather was showing in some of those website taxonomies and navigation systems, where she's saying if you repeat where the user is, they're looking for that's like a signpost through the space. So in digital web space, but also in physical travel. Okay, Allison.
Hello. My name is Allison Ladetta. Feel free to connect with me. I think it helps me a lot in my professional work when I have a good connection network, because for projects and for seeing what's going on, it helps a lot. So my background is actually in universities, nonprofits, libraries, and museums. Right now I'm at the Harvard Medical School. I'm a user experience researcher, and my department is the Countway Library of Medicine. So for my department, I lead user experience projects. And so for IA, where I wanted to start was when you Google IA and look at articles and books, I think the #1 visuals you see are these charts, these tree jacks of information architecture. And I think that if I were trying to teach AI, what is information architecture, it would immediately latch on and be like, IA is this chart. The chart is IA, I've got it. And so I think as a user experience professional, or if you work with IA in your job or in any capacity, a big part of our responsibility is to understand how it kind of connects to the entire experience. So this little graphic on the right kind of shows the chart being pasted in and connected to other little icons. And so IA, I think, has the power to connect and drive and change everything in the experience. I've seen projects where people rename one thing and suddenly, the whole community is like, oh wait, this doesn't belong here anymore. This is now a service in this other team, and very small changes can make very big differences. And so I think understanding AI really helps, when you look at it as kind of a system and a network. For my example of some time in my professional career where I knew I was doing AI, it was much earlier in my career. I was at a university and I was invited to represent my department in an IA project. And so I was actually joining a team of people who had been working for a year updating different departments' websites at this university. And we had focus groups, we had user interviews, we had card sorts, we had qualitative and quantitative data, all to update, sometimes maybe minor, as some people would see it, menu changes. And as a beginning experience in my career, that is not a normal, setup for an IA project. Before that and after that, projects have been, much less tidy. Sometimes they're neater than that. But I think I wanted to mention, sometimes I see people online criticize other people's IA projects, and there isn't a perfect IA project. I think iteration is really important to information architecture. Our culture, our communities, they're going to keep growing and changing, and I think it's our job to grow and change our IA and iterate it as our communities change, and that's just a part of the process. Thank you.
That's a really great point, Allison, about change, and it's like the context shifts. People shift, their needs shift, their environment shifts, changing all the time. Yeah, thanks. Okay, Kate.
Hi, my name is Kate Tirado. My current focus is that I am an assistant teaching professor at Northeastern University. I teach primarily graphic and information design to undergrads, and then also I teach in the graduate program for information design and data visualization. So this is stuff that comes from my practice. So I very much have always considered myself more of a generalist in design. And I think I considered myself that for a long time because there weren't quite labels for what I was doing. So as Tom was saying, he didn't know it was UX until it was called UX. I think my practice has been very much in experience design, where I'm kind of dealing with public spaces, working with UI UX, but also graphic design, and trying to make things for general public consumption, which is kind of a hard thing to do, to not have a specific audience. And that I think now is kind of tied up in under the umbrella of experience design. And my practice has been much more in information design and data visualization. So I think that where I sort of sit in terms of IA and the practice of that is in reflection of how I teach and how I've approached my practice. I find that the use for IA for me has always been about collaboration, because I've been working with architects and developers to make these projects. And then also now in teaching, there are tools within IA that I use now to communicate with my students to make sure that we're on the same page. So I've been thinking a lot about how IA wasn't a formal component of my own education, and how I could think about that more to deliver that to my students. So I'm trying to be a little bit more reflective about my practice to bring that back into how I teach these things as well. Because again, as design and our profession is ever evolving, these are things that maybe should have labels as folks go out into industry, or if they understand that they might be doing something new and might be facilitating new tools to make across different disciplines, maybe we could kind of define those together.
That's cool. Have you figured out a go-to, do you have a go-to tool that you have found works more than not?
I went through the MFA program at Northeastern as well, and Hugh Dubberly wasn't my instructor there for design theory. So for those of you who are familiar with Hugh's work, he's very much into concept mapping, and at that point in time, that wasn't a tool within my toolbox. And I didn't understand its use or its value when I saw it from afar, but I think in terms of making and using those as boundary objects to facilitate conversations or to make sure that a team is on the same page about stuff, that has been super important and like a tool that I will continue to use.
Yeah, I got to give a shout for concept maps. I use them. My students here know they're working on them now. I use them in my work. I find them to be an excellent teaching tool. So if you guys Dubberly Design, concept maps, models, his site is a great resource, Dubberly Design. But also if you're designing, what you see here is not one screen, right? There are multiple screens going on. And is there any interaction between these screens?
Yeah, so, sorry, I just put a thing up and didn't really talk about it. So this, part of why I chose this to put up is, this is at the Boston Public Library, so if you're from this area, it might be something that you're familiar with, and you might also be familiar with the fact that this is one component of a larger ecosystem that all kind of ties together. So yes, some of these are kind of live feeds of certain data that comes from, this is the Central Library, Boston Public Library, so it has a feed that pulls from the branch locations to tell kind of what's going on in the different neighborhoods. On the other side of kind of that one on your far right, there's something that the client asked for called a selfie station, where you take a little selfie, and you could apply your favorite piece of text. So it's like a lot of different things at once that require sort of really rigorous structure to understand how these components can work together, where we're getting information from, how people use it, how they know if something is interactive versus not interactive.
Orchestrating the whole, like you need to zoom out and understand all the pieces and the relationships between them in order to be able to orchestrate an experience, an information experience like this. Yeah.
Because
Okay.
you say orchestrated, can I jump in?
Yes, please.
Orchestration is such an important part of IA, with some of the things that you said, also in service design. A very jargony term that we use is touchpoint orchestration. It's very interesting because we work on, when we say touch points, we might be working on, like I said earlier, something printed, a call center that someone calls into for help, what's on the website, what's on the app, what am I getting on someone else's, what information am I getting on someone else's digital tools, and how all of this needs to be orchestrated to make sure that one picks up when the other one drops off. And then there is no mismatch of information. Also, the hierarchy of the information on each one of these touch points need to be according to research that is done to ensure that people to understand which channel people go to for what reasons. So someone might go to an app for a completely different reason than they would to a website, than they would to human services, rep. So all of that is so important. Orchestration is such an important point, and is getting more and more important. And I think service designers, we feel like we take a very zoomed out view of ecosystems, and that all sort of feeds into the work that people like you are doing, to inform the actual information architecture of websites, of UX, of spaces. Space is really important as well, because it can indicate whether explicitly or implicitly, are you welcome to sit here, or where will you find information? Should I turn left or should I turn right? And some of those things.
Yeah, those are great points. Okay, so we're going to move on to one other question, and then we'll open it up. Actually, I'm wondering how we're doing time-wise. I'm gonna cut it off here and see if people have questions at this point. Okay, and then, all right. So anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask our panelists? Yes.
Thanks. All right, my question is for whoever wants to take it. I'm curious if in the course of your professional lives you've ever had to convince colleagues, especially higher-ups, of the value of what you do. If you've run into the attitude, well, can this be outsourced? Can an intern do this? Can we just tack it on as an additional duty at the same salary to somebody? And if you have encountered that, what was your response? How did you convince the value of what you do?
Does anybody feel particularly, Tom?
I think I'll try. It happens all the time. In fact, I was thinking about even the company I work for. There's a lot of education that's going on a daily basis, trying to prove our value as a UX team. Which in one sense is a good thing, making sure people know why we're there. I remember a project kickoff that an email went around, this is a couple years ago, and it said something about, hey, make sure we get UX in this early. We really want to make sure we get the colors and the look and feel right. And I was like, well, wait, we don't, all right, fine, we do it. And let me get in the room and then show you what I can do. And that's really kind of it. It's more, I start to break it down in terms of, well, okay, if that's what you need to get me in the room, fine, I'll have that conversation with you, and then, hopefully reveal to them, by way of my wireframe prototyping, the ideation that might go on between us, that they realize there's something more being brought to the table.
Does anybody else want to take a stab at that? You go ahead.
Yeah, I have a comment on this. I think that I've mostly worked with sort of in teams that are primarily not focused on design. So in a lot of environments in my practice, I've worked with mostly developers and other types of people. But I'm a really big believer in teaching and learning soft skills, and just learning some of the language that other people are using to describe what you're doing. I think that one of the reasons why I think it's important for designers to sort of learn how to code a little bit, even if they don't want to code as a profession, is so that they can speak to developers in a way that they could understand each other. So similar to the idea of concept mapping, kind of creating a space where you have shared knowledge, whether if you're taking the same language or kind of creating those boundary conditions, at least puts you on the same page so you could understand each other's values. And I think it's just a respectful thing to do in terms of negotiating those types of transactions.
I'll just add, I find research helps a lot with that. And even if you don't have a sanction for official research, if you can do some kind of unofficial research on either whatever it is that you're working on and highlight what others think about it, or whether you are able to do a more formalized type of research, whether it's testing a prototype or usability, that can often be the thing that I've experienced that can break through to convince a larger team of the need for what you're doing. Okay, yes?
What about trying to let a client understand the importance of the steps in the process? Have you come up with any stories or analogies that you've used that you've found to be successful in getting that point across?
I guess I can take that because I'm a consultant. So I was actually going to say that we have a funny problem, which is we are hired to do a project and people pay us thousands of dollars to do it, and halfway through they're like, why are we doing this again? So the way we approach it is more and more, by we I mean MadPow, and our general approach to projects is we use participatory approaches and co-creative approaches. So it's not just about saying, hey, we're going to do this and just communicating and educating, but it's also about involving people in the process. And I love what you said about shared language and soft skills, because more and more I'm realizing that it's such an important part of what I do, to be able to facilitate these discussions and take in all these opposing points of view, opposing incentives within these large organizations, and really navigate that conversation to reach the common point of what is important to this organization. And usually it's the same thing. They're just using different words to say the same thing. And by involving them in the actual design process, we have more buy-in of the solution, as well as a higher understanding. So the solution, because we unfortunately have to drop off after we finish the engagement, but by involving them, it's more likely that the thing we built together is going to be implemented, and implemented in a good way. And also to Kate's point of shared understanding, I think that recently I just finished up my education in business, because, as I mentioned, I work on strategy, and that is so important for me to know what is important to business stakeholders. If I'm speaking to a CMO of a company, I need to know their metrics, I need to know their language. If we talk about our methods and tools in the words that we use, they might have a completely different mental model of what we are saying, and the onus is on us as designers to make sure that we speak their language instead of expecting them to speak our language.
Great point. Yep.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. I agree so much with what all my colleagues are saying, and I wanted to say getting to know your stakeholder is so helpful for both of these questions. In my work, it's usually like deans and directors, and so if you get to know what their goals are, then when you present, solutions and challenges, you can match to what they want to have happen. So if their goal is like better marketing and brand, you can show examples, some quantitative, like, here are stats about what we've done in the past and what we can do moving forward. And then, quotes always like really stick with people, even if it's, less people have different opinions of that, but quotes also help. Just again, depending on what the stakeholder is looking for. And I was going to say, in terms of kind of negotiating like value, I found it very helpful if a higher up wants you to do something and doesn't think it's very valuable, to sometimes pull up, okay, I found average Boston web designer salaries, average and showing them this is a $500,000 investment. We're not going to be able to reach that, I understand. So here's some other options and middle grounds. It kind of helps, with just communicating best.
Great, thanks. Yep. I just saw that hand first. Yep.
So real quick, I'm just curious, as professionals, what your thoughts are on things that are kind of trends in the industry right now, like design thinking and minimum viable product.
Anybody want to take that?
My answer, I think, comes more from a teaching perspective, but I think it probably also has connections to practice as well. But I think I love that folks know a little bit of what design is, or have an understanding of I don't know, whatever picture they have in their head when you say design. It's a thing. But I also find that, particularly with my students, in my like freshman classes, that people also come in with assumptions about design that are detriments sometimes to how you practice. So I think I think that unlearning some of these things, or just making sure that we don't operate with these assumptions of what design is, depending on stakeholders or students, kind of undoing those assumptions and making sure that we're all, again, sort of on the same page about things, is how I try to approach those things.
And I'm going to kind of put a little spin on that and say, have any of you found that you'll be working with somebody, a stakeholder, a client, and they will use some terms like MVP, or what's the other word you said?
Design thinking.
Design thinking. And first you even have to establish, well, what do they think that means? Has anybody had that experience?
We have, so thanks to IDEO, a lot of people now know what design thinking is, which is great because it helps us sort of validate what we do in terms of not having to sell too hard what we do, because IDEO's done the selling for us. But that causes a problem as well sometimes, because doing a 2-day workshop or a 1-week course on design thinking does not make you an expert. But people, when they approach or learn these methods, I think a lot of stakeholders sometimes see, oh, now I know how this works. It's all about slapping Post-its on a wall, and that's how it all works. But I think you said earlier, Allison, it's like design is iterative, right? And so is design learning. I think more and more as you do it over years. I've been in it for more than 10 years. You've been doing it for 25 years. Ask me about what I knew 5 years back, and that's completely different to what I knew now. And it keeps evolving and changing. And I think that is something we struggle with, at least I personally struggle with, which is clients that have a little bit of knowledge, but not too much, and none at all, because that brings in preconceived notions that aren't always true.
Yep. Good. Good. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, right here, the stripes.
So I have a question in terms of how is your approach to information architecture changes. Right now, we have an enormous amount of information coming our way from different sources, from everywhere. Our attention span is like super tiny, right? We can't read anymore, we just skip through. And with screens scaling down to now we just read on mobile and like watch Alexa and stuff. So how and what are you predicting in the future? How else we're gonna interact? And like, what is again, like, how do we change our approach to information architecture in that in mind?
I'm thinking about the future, and I'm not, the crystal ball's a little blurry on that one, but what I think about, what you made me think about in information design is get to the point, because short attention spans being a key factor. It's something I try to think about when a lot of the times I don't have a lot of persona data to work from. I have maybe some information by way of my stakeholders who talk to our clients, but even so, once it's already once removed, if not 2 or 3 times. I do my best to try and find some empathy with what I know an analyst might be doing, sitting in front of a computer trying to work with our product. But I'm also thinking about that short attention span. They've got 50 emails. They've got a meeting to run to. They have a boss that needs the report. And how can I help them get to the point? So I try to be concise in both my design execution, in how I working with tech writers to make sure that's great that you wrote this fantastic paragraph that explains everything. Now cut it in half. Okay, great. Now cut it in half again. Help me help them get their work done as quickly as efficiently as possible, so that that overall user experience is a satisfying one. That's kind of how I think about it.
I like that. Get to the point. Yeah. Any other answers?
In terms of like future technology, something I just kind of enjoy doing is looking to see, what's on the horizon. And I hope like in our lifetimes we'll see there's really exciting research being done on how technology has changed our current like working memory and how our brains are essentially changing with our technology. There's really cool like neuroscience research about how, you can have nodes attached to your head to like interact with technology without needing to move. And so you can only imagine like how would we redesign interfaces and technology interactions if you're no longer clicking but you're like directing with like mental like thoughts. And there's I think a lot of exciting new forefronts to consider.
Can I just add to it? Sorry.
Yep, go ahead.
I think also what I think about too in the maybe a more immediate future is also how interaction design is changing more towards like gesture-based, not just like this, but more like this, and then also voice-based interactions. How do they fit into the ecosystem of these things?
Okay.
My question just tied into exactly what you were just saying, Alex Law, is the information architecture for voice technology. It must be so different because the way we frame things or phrase things is so different from writing down things or looking for information. And so I'm curious to know if anyone has actually worked in that space and where they're seeing some changes.
Well, I've not designed voice interfaces, but as a service designer, that is a touch point we need to consider. So my work has gone as far as, firstly, really narrowing down what are those interactions that someone will be willing to have over voice, which is very, very challenging to first figure out. So that's, I think, for me, a step before the actual designing of the voice interaction. And we work with great content strategists who help figure that out. Within voice interactions also, there's some already pre-made almost templates of what is the person seeking out and what are some alternate phrasing to the thing that they're seeking out. So there's a lot of thought already that's gone into it. I won't claim to be an expert on that, but just sometimes we have clients saying that, oh, we want to have people make an appointment with their doctor over voice. And then when we go out and do research and we see that no one wants to do that. They don't want to do that. So this is pointless. So that's all I have to say on that.
All right, any questions over here? This side of the room? Oh, wait, did I see one back there? Yes? Okay. Sorry. We'll get to you next.
Hi. So I appreciate you guys sharing your experiences. Very interesting, especially talking about building common understanding with the people that you're working with. The concept map is an interesting tool. I'm going to look into that. I was just curious about, in terms of building shared context when you're working on a project, do you change the method that you use based on the sort of UX maturity potentially of the customer or client you're working with? I think you mentioned that some customers you work with, they may not really have a deep understanding of what UX is, and I think there's more conversation now about UX maturity within an organization. So I'm just curious if you tailor your methods based on that.
I don't know if that was directed at me, but yes, the first thing we do is figure out the design maturity of an organization when we start working with them. And the way we do that is through stakeholder interviews and asking about things they've done in the past that might help us extrapolate what is the appetite for, how crazy can we go with these guys, Do we have to spend a lot of time explaining what we're trying to do? Do we need to use slightly simpler, more scaled down tools? At MadPal, we believe in customized engagements for every client. So we never use a one-size-fits-all approach with any client because they are different. And we have this whole transformation design practice within the company that focuses on, I think they call it the design fitness model. So it's a model that they use, you can just Google that and you'll find information on that. It's a model they use to analyze the design mindedness of an organization. And that's a great first step to the activities then we plan out for them. It also gives, lately I've been having this conversation of, it's a matter of like things approaches that you use, as well as where you want to end. What is the appetite for that endpoint? Are they just looking for incremental ways to improve their tools and services? Are they looking for the radical next big idea that's going to change everything? Can they even do that? Are they held back by regulations? So try and understand that. But a lot of the times people end like in the middle. So they make all these partnerships and invest in technology that help them get away from the industry a lot, but don't be so transformative and radical. So that's all conversation we have going along with the client, and depending on where they want to end, the processes and activities that we do are all tailored to get us there.
It sounds like there's a practical aspect. It's very practical. You know, it's not just like you know, oh, you get a client project and now you can go to town and you can, you know, sprinkle design magic dust on everything. That there's a realistic
business end to this.
It needs to work for the client. They need to be able to implement it, or
exactly,
nobody's going to be happy.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Right here in the, do you still have a question? Yes, okay.
So at the company I'm working at right now, user experience design has been kind of implemented fairly recently. And so they're starting to use a lot of terms like MVP or sprints, a lot of that kind of language, but I feel like their kind of understanding and implementation of those like techniques are a little bit different than kind of what they actually are. And so when I'm trying to like sit down and work on projects with these people, they kind of assume that things will be done a lot quicker, or when they say things like it doesn't have to be pixel perfect, they're asking for like, you know, full-on mock-ups and stuff like that. So I've tried to kind of sit down with you know, people that I work with and kind of explain, oh, well, I think what you're asking for is a lot more, so I think it'll take more time. So I'll need like this amount of time and it's going to take this amount of work. And basically they tell me like, well, like you don't have that, so you're just going to have to work with it. And so when I'm trying to build these products or help them work on, you know, new ideas, a lot of times like I don't have time to like ask questions or clarify assumptions and kind of get through kind of the details before getting to the actual final product. And so oftentimes I feel like it kind of feels like I'm building a house by painting the parts first before like building the structure. And so I guess my question is like, when you're working with people like that, how can you kind of like you know, explain to them the value, I guess, of really slowing down and trying to understand the details first before you like start diving right in?
I mean, I wonder about the participatory aspect, but
So what I want to say about that, my favorite designing tool is a whiteboard with dry erase markers that work. And grabbing a colleague and bring them in the room with me and we work out some ideas together. That might be another UX designer. It might be the project manager. It might be a developer. It might be a stakeholder. And I start exposing them to my process and letting them share in that. And one of the things, you know, just part of what I've learned about my own work is I'm not always the one with the best design answers in the room. I'm going to, you know, try to put forward my own best design solution, but I respect the expertise of the other people in the room, and if I can get one or more people in there with me and we start sketching some stuff out, that helps them understand at least that it starts with a sketch, and then I can start to let them know, hey, you've got this MVP. To me, having come from the advertising world, everything was deadline driven. You also didn't touch anything if there wasn't a client attached to it. That meant there was a budget attached to it. Now that I work in the software development world, there's proof of concept that has its own MVP. There's beta versions, version 1.1, and these things sometimes don't always have clear launch dates or deadlines, and that's really uncomfortable for me, because one of the first things I want to find out about MVP is, the most valuable product means how much can we get done by a certain date. That's how I translate that. And if they can't tell me, just give me the month in all of 2020. When are we supposed to be going out the door with this thing? I work backwards from there in my mind about like how much time am I going to need. So from that whiteboard sketch into sitting down in front of Acture, which is the primary tool that I use today, I start to just rope them into the process. It's probably the best sort of way I can get people to understand exactly. If they give you some crazy deadline, 3 weeks to do something that really takes 3 months, I say just try and go for it. Show them what can get done in 3 weeks, and then sort of renegotiate. If that's available to you in terms of how much. A lot of things get de-scoped when MVP gets closer and closer to the desired launch time. So maybe it's something where you do your best under the conditions and let them understand exactly what's needed. Maybe for next time. Maybe next time the MVP will be a little bit more forgiving. So that's.
So I think, your description that you started with, where you bring somebody else into the room and you start whiteboarding, I mean that is participatory on a really basic scale. It doesn't have to be like a big client orchestrated 1-day, 2-day workshop. Yep. And what I think of is kind of in that process of, you've got a problem that you need to solve and you have a whiteboard and you have somebody else, when you start to go through that process, that questions come up. And do you find that? And
very often those questions are coming from me, and I get my best work done through collaboration. I probably give a little too much emphasis to that in my work, but it tends to work, and then it's appreciated. And going back to the earlier question, I think that also helps people understand, non-practitioners of UX and information architecture, they start to get it after a while, and I think that's sort of the slow burn of helping them understand what we do.
Like there's something to be said to having the questions come up, not you working on your own, but
right.
with other people. Have you guys found that to be useful? Kind of team working through?
I did want to add, when it comes to sprints, the bigger my professional network has gotten and the more colleagues I talk to, developers, designers, I've learned that very few organizations do quote unquote official, real quote unquote sprints. A lot of organizations say we're doing sprints or we're using sprints or agile or lean, but then they tweak it. And so it's actually a big relief sometimes to hear oh good, lots of different organizations aren't necessarily following what the book says a sprint is supposed to be. So sometimes it's just nice to know everyone, lots of people use the terms, and you work with what you got sometimes.
Yeah, I think even the company I work with now, bless them, I think they're more agile, aspirational than actual agile. It's an ongoing thing. We're sort of debating whether or not are we true agile or are we waterfall, and we're probably somewhere in between.
Okay. How are we doing for time? Should we?
Yeah, 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes? Okay. Are there any? Yes, over here.
So I was just curious, have you ever wanted to do a design project but couldn't do it due to limitations with technology?
So did everybody hear that? The question is, have you ever wanted to do a design project but you've had limitations due to technology? Like you've had an idea that you haven't been able to, the technology isn't there yet?
Yeah.
I want to say not specifically that, but one of the things I aspire to, whether I get it or not, is I prefer to design to the technology available, not necessarily to the technological skill in the room. But then reality, the rubber hits the road and you need to work with what you've got, kind of thing. So It's not about, it hasn't been for me yet about technology that's out there or isn't out there yet, and can't I design for that? Wouldn't it be great if I could design for that thing that doesn't exist yet, haven't quite got there yet?
And for me, I believe so much in scrappy innovation that often we'll be working with stuff and we're like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if, you know, we could do X, Y, Z, but it's either the technology doesn't exist or it's really expensive to implement. If we ever find ourselves in that situation, we try and scale back on the technology needed and think about other ways to hack that. So whether that's, you know, a human being doing it or a paper form or something else, some other way to hack it so you don't need technology. So I'm a firm believer of that. But in terms of like projects that I'm passionate about, at least in my company, I'm very empowered to take on anything that I want to do, and nothing can stop me from doing anything I want to do. So whatever it may be, I think that often you can just start, I think. Because you asked me that question, I feel like you have something in your mind that you want to do.
I feel like that's what I'm wondering.
That's what I'm thinking. I'm like trying to read your mind here. But if it's something that you want to do, just start. And the technology will come, or you'll find some way to work around it.
And just to add to that, I definitely, as a person that has worked a lot in exhibit spaces, as the primary designer, lead designer on these projects, I think part of my job was to sort of imagine just random stuff and not even think about the technology and let the professionals deal with that a little bit. So yeah, I've definitely had like projects that I are more aspirational than anything else, but I definitely agree that prototyping is prototyping an idea in whatever materials you have is often revealing, because it doesn't, sometimes you can scale it such that you could do the thing without the original technology that you had in mind for a different scale. And then as you kind of continue with the idea or iterate upon it or try to keep it going in different ways or bring in other people, then you kind of get more access to different things.
I love that. Okay, so I think we've had some wise words. And I think with that, we'll wrap up. So I'd like to thank you guys very, very much, panelists, for sharing your expertise and your experience, your wise words with us. Okay, great.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thanks to everybody for good questions.
Thank you so much. So I'll see you back here at about 1:20. Please do come back. The afternoon speakers are just going to be amazing. I'm just about to tweet out a list of recommended lunch locations if that would be helpful. We'll also do the raffles after lunch. See you back here soon. Thanks.